Alan, you and I have been talking about the Gospel of Mark for years now. We've taught courses on it together. And I find myself wondering, as we come to this occasion, if you could say a little bit about why this Gospel's been important in your own life and study.
The action pace in the Gospel of Mark, just the vivid immediacy of it, is just compelling to me.
Okay.
I love the way Jesus keeps coming, and there's not much time to sit back because of it always relentlessly moving forward. And so that's one of the reasons. Another is just the absence of words relative to the other Gospels makes for focus on the deeds, and I find Jesus' deeds in this Gospel compelling as well. Okay. And my question's kind of like that on a larger scale. How do you see this Gospel as a helpful book for the church in our time?
My suspicion is that, and many people share this suspicion, that Mark's actually the first one to write a gospel. To start with, there's good news about Jesus Christ. That's what gospel means. This is good news. He's the first one to say, all right, let's tell the whole story from the baptism through the resurrection. And so I think he's a great gift to the church in that he set the idea of gospel for all of us. And I think in some ways, while he writes the worst Greek of any of the gospel writers, he writes the most interesting story. That it's lively, it's cleverly put together, it's put together in such a way that it piques our interest, but also in such a way that it invites our discipleship, it invites our faith. And I suspect if I were to start a disciples class and say, all right, how do you begin to understand what it is to follow this man Jesus, I'd start with Mark. So let's start with Mark, and let's start on Mark. We're going to talk today about the first 2.5 chapters, 2 chapters and 6 verses. What's going on? What can you tell us about kind of verses 1:1 through 3:6?
Well, the first thing that somebody reading it now notices, and we're here on January 9, so we're just coming off Christmas and Epiphany, and the first thing you notice is there's no birth story. And so Mark moves from an introductory sentence to John the Baptist in the wilderness shouting, and then on to rapid-fire episodes of Jesus' life. And so a lot gets done in those 2 chapters. We move from Jesus picking up 2 disciples and then 2 more on a beach through a series of miracles that just start to reveal about him and show who he is. And over the course of those miracles and his moving forward and his getting into a little tussle here and there with the Jewish leaders, people start to be compelled by him and they start to follow him. So first it's the healing of somebody with a demon in the synagogue in chapter 1, and then it's a man who is paralyzed in chapter 2, and then it's sitting around with tax collectors and sinners and getting in some trouble for it. And we see through what Jesus does in these early chapters. We see through what he does to who he is, and people start to take note of that. And it's sort of Mark's word immediately keeps coming back because he's doing things so closely on one another, back to back on one another.
So Jesus immediately does this, then he immediately dashes to the synagogue, then he immediately ends up in Capernaum.
Yeah, it's like a kid telling a story.
Yeah, and immediately, and then, and then.
And then Dad, and then,
Yeah.
And so by the time we get to the end of this section, Jesus is a very, very popular character, and Jewish leaders are engaged with him by this time, so that he is becoming a little bit of a nemesis to them through these episodes. And that's a lot to get done in 2 chapters and 6 verses.
Let's circle back for a minute to the very first verse, which I've puzzled about a lot. And let me try something on you and see what you think. The very first verse is, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. And for the first, we won't say how many years, for many years in my life, I assumed that this was the introduction to the introduction. That is, that Mark says, this is the beginning of the gospel, and then for the next verses he talks about John the Baptist calling the disciples, preaching the gospel, end of the beginning, then we go on with the gospel itself. In the last few years, I've begun to suspect that Mark, who has no idea what the history of gospel writing is going to be, sits down and says, I'm going to write a book called The Beginning of the Gospel. that this whole thing from 1:1 to 16:8 is the beginning of the gospel, and that what he's setting up is a kind of prologue to a story that will continue in the life of the church and in the life of believers. And so the right word for this is really not the gospel by Mark, it's the beginning of the gospel by Mark. Does that make any sense
Yeah,
as you read through the first chapters?
Luke does that in a different way. In the beginning of Acts, he writes, in my first volume, I told all that Jesus began to do and say. And so he puts it overtly there.
Yeah.
I think that fits. Your reading on Mark fits what he's up to, because we'll see in the end that things don't wrap up altogether at the end of 16 chapters.
Okay.
That there's still a lot left for disciples and for successive generations to do.
Okay,
right?
so let's watch for that and
Yeah,
see
that's a good
if we
thing to
see
watch for.
hints along the way that we're along the way. We're not at the end of the story by the time we get to the end of the story.
Right.
That the end of this story is not the end of the gospel for Mark.
Right.
So let's go back to the verses we've said we're going to focus on for this discussion, which are that's first healing, and then there's the second healing where he begins to get opposition in chapter 3. What's going on in those two?
Well, they bracket this section, and Mark wants them to, because in 1:21 to 28, we get Jesus walking into a synagogue, and a man comes up to him who has a demon. And Jesus casts out the demon, and then people respond as they respond. In 3:1 to 6, it's the next time Jesus is in a synagogue, and Mark says, again, he was in the synagogue.
Right.
As if to say, do you remember that time
Here
just a
we
little
are,
while ago? Here
synagoguing
we are in
again.
the
Yeah,
synagogue
yeah,
again.
yeah.
And this time, guy walks up to him, he heals him, so far, a lot the same. But then the response, rather than general amazement, as it was in chapter 1, is the Pharisees' extreme ire and attempt to plot his demise.
Yeah.
Right? They challenge him in the moment, asking, why are you doing this on the Sabbath? And then at the end of the passage, the narrator tells us that they had often tried to plot his undoing.
Yeah.
And so the puzzle that presents itself in these first chapters is in this comparison, which is why, given all the good that Jesus is doing to the people in the countryside and in the towns of Galilee, why aren't they presenting with some kind of medal or honor rather than upset? Why are they coming at him with opposition? And it seems to me that the clue is in this meteoric rise in his popularity, because at some point it becomes a professional rivalry, I think. And at one level that's fun in a story way, right? It gives characters motive, but on another level it starts, I think, a process of realizing that these characters are built and that we can participate, we can see ourselves in the characters and kind of get ourselves into the action, because it's a real story being posed. It's not just a collection of Jesus stuff.
So when we get ourselves into the action, do we choose who our characters are, or do we say, that's me, I'm the opposition, or I'm the disciple, or I'm the demoniac, the person with a demon who needs to be healed? Does it work in that kind of, let me invite you to place yourself in the story?
Yeah, and I think there is, along with that, so if someone is getting healed, I think we can see ourselves in the place of a person who's being helped by Jesus. We can choose that role. When we get to the Pharisees, in this case the Pharisees, or the Jewish leaders generally in Mark, there's almost a melodramatic overpainting here. And so I don't know anybody who's ever wanted to choose Pharisee as somebody they are in the
very
story,
tricky, right.
And so they end up sort of a straw character in a way, against which Jesus is revealed as good and as right, and they serve not a straight man, but as a sort of foil. Which it doesn't allow us to be those people, but allows us to see Jesus relative to them, and also to be a part of the crowd assessing what's going on. I think.
I think one of the tricky things for reading Mark today, for reading any of the Gospels today, is some sense that we take those kind of foil, straw person characters from the first century and say, that's what it is to be a Jewish leader. Rabbis, that's who those rabbis are. They're the ones who are out to get us and to get him. And that becomes terrible citizenship, not very good Christianity, and finally not very good reading of the text, because we're simply translating people who were there in some ways for a literary reason, as if that was a good description of what Judaism was either then or now.
Yeah, I mean, we're in an age of Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and neo-atheists who are looking at that part of Christian history and saying the abuses of Christianity, namely, in some cases, strong anti-Judaism,
Yeah.
strong anti-Semitism,
Yeah.
are what discredits
Yeah.
it. And they find their material in characterizations like this. Right? Anti-Judaism can find its, or anti-Semitism can find its material in,
Yeah.
in these, but I have a hard time holding Mark culpable for that. Just we're dealing with a Jewish author about Jewish people and a Jewish hero and Jewish foils. In the course of history, that gets made into something else.
Yeah, no, I think that's, and if we think about the foil and the way the melodrama works, that helps a lot. I wouldn't actually trust the Native American reading of the Cowboys, because they're genuinely annoyed with good reason at the Cowboys, and vice versa.
Right.
I certainly don't trust the Cowboys' reading of Native Americans, because there was a feud going on, and neither one actually presents history in any very careful or clear way.
Right.
What about this demons thing? All right, here's our first healing.
Yeah.
A man has a demon. Oh yes, man has a demon. What in the world is that, and how do we talk about that in the 21st century?
Yeah, and one of the sort of larger matters in which that participates is, what do we do with miracles
Yeah.
in Mark? And we'll get to that.
Yeah.
But I mean, this has been called everything from epilepsy to clear demon possession. You get most scientific minds dismissing this as something pretty much every day as mental illness. You get some scientific minds saying this could be a phenomenon in our time.
Yeah.
But in the story, it's clear that part of Mark's way of presenting Jesus is that he's going to free people from the demonic world.
Yeah.
It starts in 121, but it doesn't stop there. We're going
No,
to
it
get
doesn't. Come
other
again, again.
passages along
Yeah.
the way. It's going to come back, and the drama will build as Jesus continues to confront demons, and they'll become more colorful stories even as it goes on. So it's clear to any reader of Mark that spirit world is a part of what Jesus came to confront.
Yeah. Well, it's been helpful to me as a teacher in seminaries to meet students from other parts of the world, so that what we think is a clear 21st century understanding of what's old-fashioned mythology for them is a live, vital way of talking about their experience.
Right.
And that we can learn from people for whom that way of talking is not antiquated or quaint, but the way in which they deal with pastoral oppression, what we would call psychological distress. So I would find myself in some ways wanting to revive our understanding of the way in which people can be in thrall of powers that are beyond their understanding. And there are different ways of talking about it, but the reality is not just some quaint old-fashioned first century thing.
I think you're right, and I think any chance we get to be relieved of our bondage to the Enlightenment in this area is a helpful chance. It doesn't mean we lay reason aside.
Right.
It means that we condition our position in the world.
Yeah.
We say maybe it doesn't have all the answers, and we allow ourselves to listen to cultures in which there are live options that we've dismissed long ago.
Let me try this on you as a kind of summary of what we've got going in chapters 1 to the beginning of chapter 3. That you've got dueling authorities. You've got the authority of the demonic world, you've got the authority of the synagogue, you've got the authority of the people who will ask in chapter 2 why Jesus thinks he can forgive sins, and you've got this different authority which turns out to be God's own authority. This guy's been baptized by John, this guy's heard this guy, Jesus, our Lord and Savior, has heard a voice saying, "You are my son." He has forgiven sins, he has healed people, he is gathering a crowd, and at some point we're beginning to say, who is this?
Right.
Is this someone in whose authority we can trust? And I think Mark is setting it up so that it becomes a question not just for some original audience, and certainly not just for the first disciples, but for his first hearers, and also for us hearing it all these years later.
Right. And we haven't heard it asked out loud yet, but we will.
We will, very soon.
Who is this? And it will be, so you're right, Mark has set the table for that question, but nobody's asked it yet, so we're almost waiting for the other
All
shoe
right,
to hit
so
the floor.
let's see how it follows through.
That's great.
Thank you.